We are very pleased to welcome Professor Sheila Jasanoff and Professor Amandine Catala. Just a few words from Florian and myself to present the panel. So I will just have a few words to explain what we are doing in our group Democracy and Knowledge of the GIS, Démocratie et Participation. With other colleagues, we have created this group, Axe Démocratie et Savoir. It brings together researchers and voluntary organizations working on the dynamics of knowledge co-production between science and society. It focuses on methodological, ethical, and political issues of participatory science and research. And it aims to promote interdisciplinary dialogue to stimulate debate. That's it. So this area, this group is intended to be a space for exploring the tensions and challenges raised by participatory science and research, but also the emancipatory potential and scientific advances that they enable. A collective book is in preparation to be published in 2026 by the Édition de l'Aube with the title The Scientific and Democratic Meaning of Participatory Science and Research. And now Florian will explain why we did this panel.
Thank you. So the present panel is called Epistemic Fights in Democracy. It relies on a shared view from philosophers of science and also science and technology studies analysts or researchers that our democratic regime in Europe and Americas are in jeopardy due to a backlash on scientific credibility of decades of description of the embedded character of scientific endeavors in society. Hence, the new pending question using critical inquiry on new research fronts, on the one hand, the defense of minority voices and subject matters, and on the other hand, the conditions to a resilient scientific regime confronted with an attempt to hijack science by politicians. To introduce this issue, we have asked the specialists and observers of the Western democracy regime to debate. One is a distinguished witness, an analyst of the science and scientific culture of democracy in the United States and Europe. And the other is a professor and is looking for venues to conceptualize a world with less epistemic injustice.
And now, very quickly, we introduce yourself, and then we're giving you the microphone. So Professor Amandine Catala is a professor in the Department of Philosophy at the Université du Québec à Montréal and holds the Canada Research Chair on Epistemic Injustice and Agency. She explores epistemic injustice in various fields, multiculturalism, women, minorities, etc., as well as in debates on deliberative democracy and linguistic justice. She has also examined these issues in relation to cognitive disability and neurodiversity. She has just published a book in 2025, and it's called The Dynamics of Epistemic Injustice, Situating Epistemic Power and Agency at the Oxford University Press.
Sheila Jasanoff is a Forsheimer Professor of Science and Technology Studies at the Harvard Kennedy School. She's a pioneer in the social science. She explored the role of science and technology in the law, politics, and policy of modern democracies. She founded and directed the SNTS program at Harvard, where she also formed the Science and Democracy Network. Previously, she was founding chair of the SNTS department at Carrel, where I met her when I was a postdoc at Cornell. So, in 2022, she received the Government of Norway Holberg Prize for Law, Humanities and Social Sciences. So we're going to proceed with a brief presentation of the work and concepts used by the two professors. And then we will ask two questions, one question and then an answer of both of them, and another question and then another answer on both of them, and then we open the floor for discussion. Professor Jasanoff, can you briefly present your work and in particular your notion of civic epistemology that you mentioned, defined in the book Design on Nature, published in 2005. As such, civic epistemology refers to the institutionalization practices by which members of a given society test and deploy knowledge claims used as a basis for making collective action.
Thank you, Florian, and also thank you, Marion, and lovely to be with you, Amandine, in the same panel. I want to say something historical about the origin of a term, something methodological about how I arrived at it, and then something theorizing as well. So historically, Designs on Nature, which you were kind enough to refer to, comes 20 years later than my first comparative project, which was Controlling Chemicals, which appeared in 1985. So the work that I was doing and have continued to do is interestingly situated at the margins of both of the fields that I connect. I mean, maybe there's something to explore there for a GIS organization such as yours. So for political scientists, the comparative work on technical regulation was uninteresting because they thought in terms of their independent variables and their dependent variables. And when they saw 4 Western countries being compared with, and 4 in Controlling Chemicals, 3 in Designs on Nature, from a political scientist's point of view, all of the relevant independent variables were the same. So, you know, these are all democratic countries, they're all Western, and hence have a certain level of economic and social development. They, back in the Controlling Chemicals days, they all happen to have significant chemical industries and significant public social movements that were demanding health and safety. They had similar sorts of apparatuses for regulating health and safety. So from a political scientist's point of view, this was a boring comparison because it would lead to no interesting results. The hypothesis was that if you looked at the same science and technology, in other words, the same epistemic foundations, you would get the same policy results at the other end. So that proved to be not true, and that then led me to doing the work that I do. In the meantime, on the science and technology studies side, a field that, you know, I got into somewhat sideways, most of the concern was with how does one produce and make robust a knowledge claim. And so people were looking mostly at the production of scientific knowledge by scientific communities and not so much at the wider circulation of those facts and claims outside in other contexts of application. So my work was in a sense too macro and political for STS, and not fitting within the paradigmatic orientation of the political sciences as to what makes an interesting problem. So once I fell into trying to explain why it is that the surprising result did happen, that across Western societies, the same knowledge, the same epistemic foundations do not end up leading to the same policy results, of course, I had to think about methodology and how does one produce comparative research looking at these things. And we don't really have time to get into that at the first level, but, I think that my views about how to do this changed between controlling chemicals, which was focused on, case studies of particular chemicals and how these four societies regulated them, whereas Designs on Nature was a much more longue durée thing, looking at different technological applications of genetic engineering and developing biotechnologies. And so the regularities that I came to observe in Designs on Nature were a bit different, but they stemmed from the same set of questions. What is it about the uptake of knowledge in society that leads to different ways of addressing them? And I think here is a place where a conversation between Amandine's approach and mine might lead to some interesting insights, because whereas a term like hermeneutic injustice might be a very powerful foundational concept to think about certain things, my work suggests that what the injustice is not likely to be seen in the same way, and that it relates in particular ways to even the hermeneutic side. So an example like, before there was sexual harassment, a woman might not have known how to classify her experience, but then not all societies actually end up using a term like sexual harassment to describe the thing in question. So societies do end up framing problems in very different ways. And the longue durée work, the comparative work on biotechnology, illustrated that point very directly. So what people saw as threats emerging from the biotechnological frontier, what they saw as safety or risk, and which problems even needed to be addressed, were really not the same. So I think everybody in this audience is well aware that abortion has been a flashpoint for American politics. So I was confronted, until I started looking at the empirical stuff in detail, I hadn't fully acknowledged or recognized that there was really no women's movement around abortion in the UK. Very significant, given that the abortion debates in Germany and in the US were of constitutional proportions. So in Germany, the reunification process was, after all, delayed by 2 years because the East and the West could not agree on how to treat abortion, and women's movements and their role played an enormous part in that. So, in that sense, I had to figure out, so can you treat that from the standpoint of hermeneutic injustice? It's not that the three societies didn't have ideas of abortion, everybody did, but was it a problem at all or not? And if it wasn't a problem in one country and was a problem in another, then what was it about the political cultures of these nations that might help account for that? So I was also motivated in part by the fact that political scientists uniformly rejected the idea of political culture. They said this is a non-starter because we can't find it, we can't measure it, we can't characterize it. But, I think a place of convergence between your work and mine is that, to some extent, how epistemic categories work in societies is something that one can get at and is something that one can begin to characterize in certain ways. And that's how I came up with that kind of definition, Florian, that you suggested before. Of course, I'm deeply aware that culture is a non-starter in the very field that says it studies culture, namely anthropology. Anthropologists get very edgy when you throw the word culture at them because they think you're fixing something. I myself am a student of institutions, and so my foundational claims about how ways of interpreting get fixed inside political cultures has to do with institutional opportunities to problematize certain kinds of questions. So, that's a sort of history of how I came to this idea. It's explanatory in that it helps explain how the same problem comes to be framed in different ways and hence addressed in different ways. It is also grounded in a lot of dense empirical detail about how institutions shape the uptake and the circulation of knowledge.
So, thank you. A second set of questions for you both is about what doesn't work in our democracies as far as knowledge and science are concerned. What knowledge is discredited? Who has the power and the right to know? Maybe nowadays in the USA, that's a big point. Do the researchers have power, much power, too much power? Or do researchers still have any power, we could ask?
Yeah, so there you just had a philosopher's articulation of a response to the questions. From the standpoint of science and technology studies, I think one begins in a slightly different position, which is, first of all, to talk about knowledge at all. I mean, that one of the most basic points in STS is that a fact or a knowledge claim is that because it's a collective construct. I mean, otherwise you're in the realm of belief or opinion or superstition or whatever else you want to call it. But the only reason that we're talking about whether this matters or not, partly because this is a collection of political scientists and political theorists to some extent, is what was latent in everything that Amandine said, that there are consequences hinging on what one believes or not. So, probably all of us knows somebody who's colorblind, but most of the time you can forget it, and it doesn't matter that when that friend of yours looks at a traffic light, they see very different colors, and it's experientially completely different to them from what it is to you. You may have friends who regulate their lives by astrological ideas, or in France that engage in homeopathic medicine or whatever. And it doesn't matter much to you because you can either believe the same thing or not believe the same thing, and you have opportunities to lead your life however you please. So, in those domains where my freedom is not being constrained by another person's belief or another person's perception or another person's knowledge, I don't much care whether there is a collective belief or not. So, although STS says that knowledge is constructed and it's communally held and socially ratified and so on and so forth, we don't care about those processes all that much until you actually can start using categories like dominant or marginalized. And that means that there's a background political dynamic in effect that makes it matter whether or not whose collective knowledge is going to guide the day. So that's one strand of background theorizing and scholarship that's enormous and that's out there. A further thing is, what ideas of enlightenment and arriving at a better state of knowledge have we inherited over the years? It's interesting to note that when Kant wrote his What is Enlightenment piece, one of the things he said pretty explicitly was that the ultimate goal is for people to know for themselves without the need of mediating institutions. And he specifically talks about doctors, for instance, that one should know one's own condition without a mediating doctor, or teachers and instructors, people who are going to interpret books for you. So that sort of original idea, late 18th century, of the Enlightenment was that we should all become sufficiently aware to be able to judge reality and make decisions on that basis for ourselves. Well, arguably, in the era of social media, we should have arrived at that Kantian epitome of enlightenment because everybody is entitled now to see the world and perceive the world in whatever the way they please, right? But in American legislative policy, there's long been a saying that everybody's entitled to their own opinions, but everybody's not entitled to their own facts. This is often said as a colloquial thing about truth in politics. So I think one has to step back and say, how do these two things sit together? That, there's a strand of philosophizing about knowledge that says that the ultimate goal is to know for yourself with nothing but accountability to nature as your commandment, but then a social system that says, sorry, you're not entitled to your own facts. People have to, have a shared factual basis, otherwise there can't be a politics. So when you walk down that road, your attention gets drawn to the certifying institutions. How is it that out of the morass of stuff that could be said, could be experienced, could be perceived, we end up with any kind of collective judgment about anything? And you can do the thought experiment for yourself. I mean, how do you know that climate change is happening? I mean, and you will find that there are numerous mediating institutions about which you had to make a judgment, whether you trust their findings or not. And it may be that whether you're included in the decision-making processes of that institution matters. I think that if you look at the American left progressive world, in which belief in climate change is profoundly embedded, shared, dispersed, most of those people are not included in IPCC deliberations or, in any kind of sense of democracy and participation. I mean, which of us really have had a say in 6 different assessment reports that tell us that climate change is happening, that it's serious, that it's going to affect us, that there's an urgency to it, and that we should behave accordingly. So I think if you set up the chain of belief by which most people like us come to take something like climate change for granted, or come to take, statements like exposure to asbestos is likely to cause cancer and you shouldn't do it, or smoking is a bad thing, certainly more so when you're in the US than in France, but nevertheless, I mean, you're not allowed to smoke in the metro anymore, and you did used to be. So how did those things come about? We don't know these things of our own judgment. Most of us haven't participated in producing those facts. So it's instead that there are mediating institutions whose credibility we have come to accept, partly because we set up the procedures in ways that accord with the civic epistemologies that I was talking about before. So in America, in line with a fairly open knowledge system, those procedures have for 60 plus years, more like 70 years, included that any person who's interested in or affected by the creation of some form of public knowledge can go and participate. Do they do it? No. But people do have a sense that if you feel strongly about something, you can write to the agency in question and so forth. There's a stark contrast between that and the British approach to administrative rulemaking and administrative knowledge-making, because I had to study Britain to even understand a term like invited participation. So it's not that the interested and affected person can run in there. You actually have to be invited to participate. So in a scheme of public knowledge generation where the test characteristic is interested and affected versus another in which it's invited versus uninvited, I think the questions of dominance and marginality will play out differently, and one might, think about that to some extent. I mean, that is, ideas like dominance and marginality themselves presuppose a hierarchical ordering of society that people have to buy into. Today, Friday, Mr. Zohran Mamdani is meeting Mr. Donald Trump in the newly gilded White House that Mr. Trump inhabits. Mr. Trump's press secretary said, "Look how open-minded we are. We're even welcoming a communist into the White House." And that's how liberal Mr. Trump is, that the president will talk to anybody and everybody. So, there's Marxism being interpreted in a certain way by the spokesperson for the president of the United States. And I can tell you it has very little to do with the proletariat understanding itself that you had in mind, Amandine. So, I doubt that Trump even has any idea what that word means. But anyway, it's just an illustration that in sort of everyday workings out of politics, there are theories of dominance, non-dominance at play that have to do with prior constructions of the world that lend legitimacy and meaning to those kinds of words. So I think I'll say a little bit about the crisis of truth in the US at the moment and stop there and let us proceed with the rest of the discussion. I mean, what is for sure is that the right in America came to understand some of the tenets of science and technology studies in a way better than the left. So I think that the right, because it was marginal, in a sense, over the post-war period and lasting, beyond Ronald Reagan's presidency, you can take that as a sort of point where the right begins to gear up. I think they became aware of the need of institutional foundations to push a set of points of view, and that in order to have a truly subversive mindset that takes things apart, you have to take apart the institutional authorizing mechanisms of the other side. And what are those mechanisms? Well, there's a two-pronged attack in progress in America at the moment. One is against research universities and the whole idea of publicly funded research and neutral expertise, and so everything from the granting of public money to do research in certain areas, partly by just erasing certain areas off the map. So no more research on gender, no more research on racial diversity, no more research on climate. I mean, these are heavy-handed things, but I think they betray a kind of obvious, self-evident political understanding that there is a co-productionist thread in making public knowledge, and if you take away the ontology that people are supposed to be caring about, you're not going to have the knowledge about that thing either. So part of the attack is on anything that is quasi-independent and knowledge-making, research funding, universities, and part of the attack is on expert bodies that have been in the business of combining factual observations with judgment and producing reliable public knowledge. So that is the attack on the Food and Drug Administration and the Centers for Disease Control and, of course, the EPA. So these are not historically new movements. That is, FDA has gone through cycles of reputational riding high, high credibility, and periods of relatively lower credibility. EPA, I think, has never enjoyed a period of sustained high credibility, but there have been more attacks and fewer attacks over the years. But right now, I think one sees that any body in American society that has the job of taking a collection of facts and turning it into a collective understanding of what the world is like, those institutions are under attack in different ways from an administration that understands very well that to push its own views forward, it has to dismantle the apparatus for generating public knowledge that the other side has.
Thank you. So you tackled a little bit of the next question when you speak about how to take apart, you have to take apart the institutional mechanism to take apart the scientific claims that are made by these institutions. So the second set of questions is about exactly that point, and the question is what kind of check and balances are possible in knowledge production and disclosure. Your research are both dealing with pluralism in knowledge production and expertise. For your point of view, how is it possible to fight against the confrontation of epistemic power in the end of the few?
Thanks for the question, Florian. So the question, or the set of questions, ended with, how is it possible to fight against the concentration of epistemic power in the hands of the few? So I wonder if that is the right formulation for us today in the here and now, and I also think that the answers have to be they can't afford to be bloodless in a way, because what we're witnessing is a kind of revolutionary moment, and we have to put ourselves on one side or another, or choose sides, or make sides, or it's not kind of neutral, purely academic territory. So I think we accept a lot of putting power in the hands of the few, including epistemic power. I don't think most of us, when we want a diagnosis of a medical problem, really want to trace every pathway back to foundational chemistry to figure out, what exactly is going on. Sometimes we want to delve into it more, sometimes less, but sometimes we just want the prescription and the pill and hope that it will go away. So I think that more to the point is what makes us accept the concentration of power, and then if the conditions for acceptance are not met, then those are the conditions for fighting, in a sense. There's also the question about epistemic power and power in general. So when is it that it's okay for people who enjoy power not through epistemic practices, because epistemic practices are every bit as significant as political practices, but people who seem to enjoy epistemic power because of political practices and not epistemic practices, are not necessarily the ones that we want to be making our public facts for us. So in America, the dynamics are very different from what Amandine just laid out. The perception in America at the moment, the dominant one, the one coming out of the White House, and that won the election, after all, the last time in 2024, pretty fair and square. I mean, the most sort of severe wake-up call for the Democratic Party was that people have been talking about this ontology of swing states for some time now in the political process. A swing state is one where you can't predict whether it's going to go Democratic or Republican, and there were 7 of these. And the fact is that Kamala Harris lost in every single one. So if I had to cite a single reason for why the Democrats in America are so demoralized, it is that very clean sweep of those swing states, suggesting that the swing is not as much of a swing as one might have thought. Now, what was to blame for that is the rise of a minoritarian position, probably representing about 30% of the current American population. It's very hard to put exact numbers on this, saying that the attempt to diversify the knowledge base to secure epistemic democracy had gone too far, to the point where they were now the marginalized. So, white privilege talk out the window. The whites are now the victimized, and the males are now the victimized. And why? Because, in fact, over the last 20 years or so, a lot of administrative practices had been put in place in order to ensure that certain kinds of other previous forms of dominance would not be exercised without question. So 2 extremely culturally mobilizing features in the last political election were focused on gender and focused on race. The George Floyd murder didn't galvanize deep soul searching across the society. It helped cement a particular set of ideas that said structural racism is a problem and we have to do everything to weed it out of dominant white institutions. And that turned out to be enormously politically mobilizing for the other side. Similarly about gender, where it's even more marked in a way, because we had got to the point of having to declare pronouns, and I'm not sure to what extent. I mean, I know that other countries, France and Germany, have their own, gender language issues, and how do you represent gender neutrality. But I don't think it had quite reached the point that we in universities, for instance, in America, experience that you couldn't enter a meeting, and this was particularly true during COVID. I mean, you met on Zoom, and people went around the table, so-called, except it was a Zoom room, and you had to declare your pronouns. And, this was felt by a lot of people to be intrusive and not necessarily something that even was a matter that you should have to declare in order to be in the room in the first place. It was also kind of asymmetrically applied. I mean, so if you wrote that your preferred pronoun was he, him, or she, her, institutionally, when I got letter of recommendation requests, there was no AI smart enough to say that, Robert so-and-so requests that you write a letter for him, or Nancy so-and-so requests that you write a letter for her. You could certainly get into the guts of the Harvard system and learn that Robert preferred he, him, and Nancy preferred she, her. But the bureaucratic language said Robert and them, they want you to write a letter for them. So in a way, the bureaucracy was actually flattening out the preferences that people were asked to declare through their individual declarations. So it was not the case that the liberalizing tendencies had led to a liberalized set of practices whereby everybody could assert themselves individually in the ways that they wanted. And so I think the flexibility of these constructions, like when is a perception minoritarian? I am a South Asian, I'm an Indian, there aren't too many academics of my stripe, particularly women in American academia. There are more now. Certainly by the time you say, do they wear saris, I often end up being in a minority of one. But you could also look at me through the lens of intersectionality as a Harvard professor and as, somebody with intellectual power in the world and with recognition that comes from status and with all the forms of bourgeois capital, and then would I be a minoritarian? No. So, you can count a person like me as being in a minority position or not in a minority position, and to some extent, it's in the eye of the beholder, but to some extent, it's also in the eye of the people organizing themselves against power, because newly emergent categories and newly emergent lines and newly emergent forms of action have installed themselves in some ways. So if you despise the way in which politics is happening in America right now, I think you have to recognize all of that. You have to recognize that there are genuine arguments on the other side, that there are felt reinterpretations of personhood, that there are data, like, the only category of people for whom life expectancy has gone down in the last 10 years or so in America is white men of middle age. So, why is that? And how epidemiologically should you weave that into a theory of power, domination, and whatever? So, I may not feel inclined every morning when I wake up to shed a few tears on behalf of my white men colleagues, but I also have to deal with these kinds of positions that are of economic significance and, defects in the construction of we're building better and better worlds just by virtue of lifting up the bottom. I also don't think that the pronouns have done a single thing, not one single thing, to improve the economic position of the people that we're trying to help out, whether in gender terms or in other terms. So, in terms of how do you get to reducing inequality, the kinds of identitarian politics that Americans accepted fairly unquestioningly are not necessarily nearly so powerful as the kind of politics that Mamdani has been playing in New York, where his position has been, you have to go out to people, you have to talk to them or hear them. If people say this is a once-in-a-generation political talent, and I think my God, what have we done to politics if this is so once in a generation that you actually have to listen to people and then channel back what they're trying to tell you? You know, so obviously what he was intent on showing is that there are people who are not voting, who are not expressing themselves because the institutional structures have systematically made them feel unheard, and that these other lines of differentiation, whether of gender, whether of race, whether of color, are not as important as a word like affordability and all that it connotes in the American context. So I would say that my response to all of these questions is analytically be very, very careful that many of the words that we use to analyze our positions are themselves subject to standpoint orientations, that the meanings differ depending on where in history, where in politics, you know, where nationally, in which civic epistemology, in which political culture you stand when you interpret these categories in the first place. And I think that one has to first say, what is it that I want out of this better world? And then what are the actions that I need to take to bring it about? I am not happy with the current administration of the country whose citizenship I hold. But I don't think that a simplistic, you know, elevate the position of the minority is a great answer for a country in which a minoritarian position in numerical terms has succeeded in arousing a majoritarian wave of grievance that I think we need to take apart from a knowledge politics point of view before we reconstitute something approaching a progressive politics that a majority of the American people will be willing to believe in.
Thank you.
So now we ask if people have questions. We have something like 10 minutes. Yes. Questions from the... Yes.
Thanks for the workout. And thank you both for your excellent talks. I have two ice-breaking questions. The first one is how you would connect the notions of epistemic injustices and civic epistemologies with more canonical notions for a French audience, such as symbolic domination or class contempt. And second question, from a more practical standpoint, do you think that these notions could evolve into categories for public action or even evolve into and enter legal frameworks the same way that the notion of non-take-up of rights has entered social policy following the seminal research from sociologists in the Netherlands? So then, supposing you or we win the epistemic war that Florian alluded to, how would that help reshape how institutions reckon and respond to marginalized voices and knowledges? One might think of a more institutionalized forms of the special credibility or reason giving that Amandine mentioned. One might also think of political measures such as declaring an election invalid if a certain turnout threshold has not been reached, or if a certain number of blank votes has been cast. So what's your take on that?
Is there another question or? No. Okay.
So in spite of the beauties of microphones and amplification, I'm not sure I totally clearly heard the distinction between your two questions, but certainly on the point of, do I think that categories like this can enter into political discourse in the same way as rights or whatever? I mean, you know, theoretically the answer is, of course, yes, especially if you buy into the philosopher Ian Hacking's ideas that once you generate a new vocabulary for describing things, that the world can fall into place around those ideas, but they have to be powerful enough for people to recognize themselves in that. I mean, this is where Amandine's point about things like empathy and tacit knowledge mattering, and in fact, even about the sexual harassment point, you need to get to a point where people are, in a way, looking for a new way to talk about their own felt marginalization or the absence of a justice position in the world in which they had any role in crafting their positions. So something like civic epistemologies may be, at one level, overly abstract to ever, I mean, another way to put what you said is, when does an analyst's category become an actor's category, right? So maybe, I mean, I sometimes joke that if people understood civic epistemologies, then I would be out of a job because it wouldn't exist. Because civic epistemologies, to me, operate at that subterranean level where people are not consciously doing a set of things. They're just, by inclination, orientation, habitude, doing certain kinds of testings of the world, which are also institutionally facilitated. Like in America, you can, you're either for something or against something, Americans have a very hard time dealing with STS scholars who don't want to give a straight answer to, are you for AI or against AI? I've been asked this a zillion times. I mean, and as soon as you say that's not the right question, their eyes glaze over and they go and have a martini somewhere else. So, I mean, so a vocabulary of analysis that says, this is how Americans are, how long will it take for Americans to understand them in that way if they're actually quite proud of how Americans are? So, I think that it's a very interesting analytic question. When does a description of the world become taken up? But I think you have to have the orientation and the felt perceptual injustice for the thing to take hold. So, something like Gus Field's study of how a public problem became a public problem might be a very situated case study, as might Amandine, your example of the blackface case. But, you have an recently ex-prime minister who himself, one of the scrapes he got into was that he liked dressing up, and one of the things he liked was painting his face other colors. I mean, but the Canadian impact of that thing wasn't the same as the Belgian impact of the St. Nicholas thing. So, I think that, and, you could put side by side with that all of the Indian cosmetics that get sold to lighten your face in various ways. And so I think that one has to actually look at the context of the example to see how it's going to galvanize people.
A last question. So I have one. So I go back to Amandine's difference between equal credibility and special credibility in terms of the discrepancy between what should be in an equal ideal of a society and what is exactly happening with dominated people who have a special equality to fight for, not a credibility with equal people, but a credibility special to dominated people. So you mentioned the question of trust, and I think that's an interesting question. Going back to Sheila's notion of we are shaped by our influences and by our habitudes and by what's going on. I'm not saying unconsciously, but I'm saying like a routine that we are entering. And so the question of trust is very important for me as a link between your two talks. How you, in a philosophical way, how you conceive of trust in terms of epistemic justice, and how in a in an institutionalized way, you can conceive of trust in terms of how it relates to practical matters and check and balance or stuff like that.
Yes, so thank you, Florian, for putting the word trust into the conversation, because it already is in the conversation, and therefore we should have a response to it. But I'm going to be a bit perverse. I mean, when you said fighting against concentration of epistemic power, I said maybe you should be thinking about accepting rather than fighting concentrations of epistemic power. But with trust, I mean, you know, I think that one should really question whether one adopts the word trust as a normative position, something that we want to aim for in society, because I think, you know, the democratic posture may actually be one of distrust rather than trust, and then you have to carve out some reason for trusting rather than distrusting. You know, keep in mind that the first person who, you know, sort of burst on the scene as a sociologist of science in America, Robert Merton, had organized skepticism as one of his 4 criteria for what makes science work. So for the making of knowledge, the skepticism is what's important, but the ordered is important as well. So not just any old skepticism. And of course, we know from experiences with children that they are often extremely distrusting of parental power, and we know extremely well how they get disciplined into understanding parental power. I mean, you know, you're saying why I should go to bed. Why should I go to bed? I'm not feeling sleepy. And, you know, and experimenters regress, the infinite questioning of authority that Harry Collins found in his earliest work on scientific experiments. I mean, you know, at the end, some heavy hand of power comes down and says, because I said so. And, you know, whether that I is God or Donald Trump or whatever, I mean, you know, you can then ask whether you're happy with the organization that says, you must do this because I said so in the end. But you know, my posture is that I'm perfectly happy not to trust people. I'm perfectly happy to be asking questions about why these routines and not other routines. And the position of skepticism has actually led me to a better understanding of the way societies work than the position of trust. I mean, trust has to be earned, not just bestowed.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.